Luke 1, 1 through 4. Luke 1, 1 through 4 is where I'll be. Since many have undertaken to compose a narrative about the activities which have been accomplished among us. He's referring to the other three Gospels. Most likely Luke was probably one of the last ones written, maybe John after, but either way, Mark was definitely written before. And since he mentions other Gospels, Matthew probably was. There's also, we got to understand that there's probably false stories going around too, which even though that they were false, Luke was led by the Spirit to write the truth. Even though there was some false teachings, they were still out there. So we got to be careful and we got to do that today, and that's the point I'm going to make, because there is teachers out there that are going to teach false things and call it truth, and we got to discern between them. And as Luke was being led by the Spirit, he had to be able to discern what was the truth as he pinned it down and what was not. And I'm sure also being led by the Spirit, he had to, because if he wrote down everything, his gospel would have been much longer than the Bible itself. So he had to use the Spirit, allow the Spirit to discern what to put in his gospel and what not to. Because we see in John how if everything was written down, the world itself could not contain the works of Jesus. So we see that not everything could be included. So we had to discern what was in and what wasn't. So, verse 2. Just as they who were eyewitnesses from the beginning and ministers of the word delivered them to us. So one cool thing about Luke writing his gospel is there was people still around at that time who firsthand witnessed every single thing he wrote down. As he was writing it, and after he wrote it and it was being passed out, people would have read it and been like, I remember that happening. And it would have been like a flashback to them some way, because they would have, and it would have. So he also, by that witnesses being around when he wrote it, gave him accountability of what he put down and what he didn't. It also allowed him to check to make sure this was what actually happened and get it credited to. It's similar to us actually what Luke was doing, studying Scripture before presenting it as a lesson or just studying Scripture to draw ourselves closer. This was similar to what Luke was doing by going to these eyewitnesses. Of course, he was fully relying on the Spirit when he penned the Scripture down, but it was more of a study of what happened beforehand before he did by talking to them. And also he's making mention of this because his letter is mainly to the Gentile people. And he's using it to try to lead them more to Christ than what was. And for mainly they're just wanting this story just to have the gospel in their hands, not really point of conversion. So Luke's using this to tell them, okay, this is accurate and this is what happened. So if you want to know, just read it. So he's using this more as encouragement to have those who haven't yet accepted Jesus read this story, because this is what the people have been talking about. Because at this point, while there was a few Gospels written at this point, to get the full picture that Luke wrote, they'd have to go to person and hear the whole story. And so Luke just pinned it down, and he was telling them, instead of having to go to many people, you can read it for yourself now. Which we as Christians nowadays, we got the whole Bible we can go to. It's easiest accessible as it ever has been before. Most people can pull it up on their phone and just go to it. And this isn't the luxury they had back then. Verse 3. It consequently seemed good to me, also having accurately followed everything from beginning to write to you, most excellent Theophilus. So this is a guy who's sending the gospel to. And it's a Greek, most likely some type of Greek leader. It ain't... So he's making it accurate. And Luke's gospel actually is, while most of the gospels at this point were sent mainly to the Jewish-based Christians that were there because they were sent before Paul really started bringing the gospel to the Gentiles, Luke was written after Paul, somewhat after Paul started bringing the gospel to the Gentiles. So Luke very well may be one of the first gospels written to go directly to the Gentile nations and be dispersed amongst the church that God allowed Paul to start growing. Which before Paul, it was mainly Jewish Christians, but Paul was called by God to bring it to the Gentiles. And now Luke is writing this gospel so they have it. So it's pretty cool how God's using this whole thing. And Luke was very close to Paul, so most likely his influence of the Gentiles would have been through Paul. Verse 4, that you might know the certainty of those things in which you have been instructed. So what he's also doing this is because there are being lies and false gospels floating around. For every truth, there's probably 3 or 4 lies. And that's the significance of why Luke's writing this. Because word of man, sometimes there would have been some out there telling the truth and actually what Luke was writing been shared. But there also would have been people who had their own agenda, maybe. And oftentimes preachers with their own agenda are the ones that spread lies because they want you to believe what they are trying to promote rather than what God did. And so people would have used stories and created stories to promote what they wanted. And we see this with, if you look at ideas of the stuff that ain't in the Bible or written about the time, we see certain ideas of like celibacy and certain things that they were trying to write and try to push. So most likely at this point in time, if those people had them ideas, they were trying to push them and say that Jesus said it in some way. So Luke's writing this to cut and say, well, no, that's just their agenda. This is what Jesus was really saying and really pushing. Because you got to think also at this time, the Jewish Christians were trying to make the Gentiles come to the Jewish way, being circumcised, living in the Jewish life. So there very likely a gospel out there that's being promoted and being said that Jesus said this, that they must become Jewish to be accepted in the church. It's very likely that this was somebody was spreading that. So this could be one of the reasons why Luke was led to write his gospel. So that they know, hey, no, Jesus died on the cross. That's where it's done. Just turn to Him. The work was done on the cross. And today, as there is lies out there, we got the Word to turn to. And we also got the Spirit. And I feel if their message, and we're truly paying attention to Spirit, digging in the Word, praying, we'll know if they're full of lies or if they're speaking the truth. Now, this isn't saying that everybody who may have a different opinion is spreading lies. But sometimes people want to promote their own agenda. And oftentimes, what we got to watch out for is those who promote oftentimes false teachers will put what they were promoting above the cross or what the grace and love of Christ. And oftentimes that's how you can pick apart one of the false teachers. They very rarely speak of what Jesus did, but they'll speak more of what they are trying to push. And so we got to dig in the Word. And if somebody directly says something that's opposed to a word, Of course, human error comes into play, and we got to discern that. But if they're promoting something, speaking something that directly goes against Scripture, then they're not of the Lord. It's not the truth. So we got to stay in our word to know and be able to decipher. That's why Luke went to people who firsthand witnessed. So he could, as the Spirit led him and gave him the words, he'd know what to pin down.